Hey everyone, Mekkah here, and welcome back to the Fire Emblem archetype tier lists. And today, as you probably guessed, we're looking at dancers, refreshers, and similar units, of which there is exactly one. I thought when I first decided to do this would be an easy one. Just shove everyone to S or A tier, call it a day, because all these units are similar, and a lot of their availability is similar, a lot of their uses is similar, and are all good. So easy. But apparently, as I was compiling them into this tier I'm calling Revolution for reasons you can guess, it turns out they're actually quite distinct. Every game does something to make the dancer a little bit unique and a little bit interesting. So we're going to be here for a while after all. If you're wondering about the big tier list, the biggest tier list ever, those are in the making. People are submitting characters right now. The deadline is probably past as this video goes up. But if you're a Patreon and you want to submit a character still, you can try. I can't guarantee they'll make it in. Depends on whether I've recorded it or not yet. But you're welcome to try. So, what we've got here, we've got Zane from Fire Emblem 1, 3, 11, and 12. He's not a dancer, he's an imitator, or a commander, or a transformer, or whatever you want to call him. He transforms into people, but everyone else is a refresher of some kind. So we got Fina from FE3 Book 2 and FE12 New Mystery of the Emblem. We have Sylvia, her daughter Lean, and her substitute Layla. We have Laura from Thracia 776, we have Lorem from the Binding Blade, we have Nils and Ninian from the Blazing Blade, we have Tethys from Sacred Stones, we have Raisin from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, and as well from Radiant Dawn we have Raphael and Leanne, and from Awakening we have Olivia, from Fates we have Azura, and from The Last Promise, we have Anakin. And then from Three Houses doesn't have one dedicated dancer, but you can turn just about anyone into a dancer. I decided to just take two units that are commonly picked as dancers and talk about them a little bit. I've recently both discussed these units, but more as combat units than as dancers, so I have a little bit to talk about there. Technically, I could put anyone from Three Houses on here, because literally anyone could be a dancer besides like the faculty and Byleth. But, that would make the tier list way too big. So we're just going to go with these, and I'll talk a little bit about the Three Houses mechanics when it comes to dancers at all. But first, let's get into Zane. So Zane is weird because he doesn't actually refresh another unit, but he's still kind of a clone of other units. The general trend when people rate dancers is they just kind of treat them as clones of another unit. I think this is an okay way to approach it, but I think it doesn't quite cover how versatile they are. What I like the most about most of these dancers is that they act as extra mobility for another unit. So you can move a unit like 5 spaces, dance to them, and then it can move their full move basically at the start of the game, or pretty much any turn of the game. Depends on where your dancer is positioned and where your other unit is positioned, but they add mobility to other units. And Zane doesn't do that, but he still acts as a clone of your best unit. So if the best unit for any given chapter, say it's FE12, it's Pala, for example, usually, or maybe Katria, or maybe Marth, depending on who it is. He can transform into them, and he copies just about everything from them. He copies their weapon levels, he can use their personal weapons if you trade it to him. He copies their stats, obviously, except HP. HP is a little weird. I believe in pretty much every game he copies their max HP, but not their current HP. So if you want him to be at full HP, you have to use like a recover staff on him, because his base HP is pretty low. It's like sub 20 or something. It's pretty goddamn low, but it's like a tiny little flaw. Now, I've said before, I'm not super experienced at FE3 Book 1 or even Book 2 or FE1. I've played those games, but I haven't finished all of them. So, someone who's been in the comment section helping me out in that regard with additional info is Pala Emblem, so thank you very much. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on anything. But I think Zane is one of the worst units on here. I don't know if he's quite the worst. The problem I have with Zane is that, as I said, he doesn't add the mobility. And particularly for a game like Shadow Dragon, that is often very heavily influenced by warp and being able to just warp skip maps. If you do that kind of playthrough, if you're 1 or 2 turning almost every chapter, Zane has almost no utility. There are exceptions, of course. There's chapters where you have to recruit other units. Something like the chapter where S joins in Shadow Dragon is where you can get a bit of utility out of Zane, because you got to stick around for a lot of turns anyway, which means you got to fight a lot of enemies. Don makes this very clear in his 0% growth playthrough. I think that one really shows the power of Zane. I think he transforms into Pala, who is Don's best unit at that point in Shadow Dragon. So those kind of chapters he's pretty good. But if you're warp skipping, then chapters only last 1 or 2 turns, and Zane has to take a player phase to transform. So on turn 1, he's basically not doing anything that's useful to you. After turn 1, sure, he's probably your best unit. The other drawback that Zane has that other dancers do not, or that dancers in general do not, is more of a mechanical one. it's that he can transform into a unit, but he can't untransform it willingly. He stays the way he is for, depends on the game amount of turns. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of that. I think there's some kind of RNG in it at some games, so it's very weird, but he's stuck as a unit. So if your best unit changes from turn to turn, then Zane cannot transform into them. If you take like FE7 for example, for like a portion of the map, Marcus might be your best unit, but then at another point you might want your stat user to get more XP. So Ninian can dance depending on what the situation needs, but Zane cannot untransform and transform into something else. I don't think this is a super big deal because generally you'll be able to pick the best option regardless, and you'll still add like a lot of value. But I think this is something that Zane doesn't have that other units do. Now, on the flip side, Zane is lower maintenance. You don't really like dancers for them to keep up and stay safe. You need to protect them. Zane doesn't have that kind of problem. You just transform him into one of your best units. Let's say in Shadow Dragon you have a super strong general or hero Setgar. You can transform him into him. You have 2 Setgars for however long he stays transformed, and from there he's gonna be good on his own. You just need to heal him at first, and then when he gets hurt. But the same goes for your other units, so he doesn't take extra babying, so that's pretty good. But I still think I'm gonna put Zane in like an A or a B tier, like high B or low A. I think he's good, but I don't think he's as good as like your actual best units. Whereas for the dancers, I actually think they add a lot more. I'm gonna put him in A tier for now. We'll see where it goes. He might end up at the bottom of A. Let's see. For like which one of these is the best? I think the Shadow Dragon one, which is this one, is the worst because in that game the warp skipping thing is a bigger factor. FE12 also has warp, so you could warp skip there, depending on the difficulty. But hold on, let me change something real quick. This looks ugly to me. Here we go, much better. In FE12, warp skipping is a factor, but only in lower difficulties because they remove the warp staff from Lunatic. So if you're playing on Lunatic, then Zane, I think it's relatively worse, or actually better. Yeah, because if there's no warp, then he's better. There you go. You got it, Mekkah. You got it. There you go. This one, Zane is weird to rate because he should reflect like FE1, FE3 book 1, and FE3 book 2 all at once, which is kind of tricky to do. And I have little to no experience with that one. So I'm gonna just keep it like it is. I think I'm pretty confident the Shadow Dragon one is the worst, but I'm not sure about these rankings between FE12 and like all these older games. So feel free to add me to that, but pretty sure they're all roughly equal. I don't believe there's anything super major mechanical different. One other thing to mention, I guess that's funny, is that in his original class he can actually use swords and quote-unquote fight, but he's so terrible that should never be your best option. There's one thing I need to mention about Zane though, before I forget. one last thing, and that's in FE12. There is a map where the starting point is pretty close to the cease point. It's the chapter where you're returning to your home castle, Arcanea, or Martha's returning rather, and there is like a small moat / river between the starting point and the seize area, the peninsula where the gate is that you need to seize. And Zane can walk across it in his untransformed class, but once he transforms into like something like a bishop, for example, he cannot anymore. What you can do is you can move him onto the water tile as a commander, and then have him transform into, say, a bishop with the rescue staff, or yeah, mostly the rescue staff, and use that to get Martha across, for example. So that's one way you can cheese that chapter without using warp. I always found that quite interesting. Alright, next up is Fina, also from Arcanea, but only in Book 2 of FE3, and also in New Mystery of the Emblem, Heroes of Shadow and Light, blah blah blah, long title. I think Fina is an example of just dancers the way they usually are. I think her availability is a little better than average. She joins in Chapter 7 in both of these from the top of my head, whereas if you look at the others, they generally join like about halfway through the game. So like Ninian joins around like Chapter 21, Teth joins in like Chapter 10 or Chapter 13, Raisin joins in like Chapter 18 or something. So comparatively, she joins very early, and I think that's very good. And she has the ability to use swords, which not a lot of these other ones have, which doesn't really matter very much, but I just think it's fun to mention. FE3 Book 2 doesn't have Weapon Triangle, and FE12 does, but you don't always want to make use of it when you have a sword. A lot of enemies have lances, not all of them. FE12 is definitely more varied than, say, FE7 or FE11, but still. Generally you don't want to fight with your dancer. In fact, usually the difficulty with dancers is trying to get them to avoid combat. And that can be the reason why most casual players are kind of hard on them in their first playthrough. They're hard to use. They're very hard to keep alive because they can't counterattack. And even if they get attacked and they survive, it's still kind of annoying. And often they won't survive because their HP, defense, and often their resistance is garbage. So new players often have trouble using them. But I think you'll find that if you take your time to plan your turn out, if right away when your turn starts, you go, alright, I'm going to do with dip my band. I'm going to use my dancer for this. If you plan your turn around that, you'll find that they're the most rewarding units to use, because the ability to just make your best unit move again, basically use your best action twice, whether it's like using a staff again, or having your best units attack again, or having your flyer move a bunch of extra tiles. That can add so much utility, but it is hard to do. Especially with Fina sometimes, the fact that she cannot get rescued, while the other dancers, for example the GBA games and Laura, they all can be rescued. That can help a little bit. With Fina, you really have to be very particular about your positioning, because one mistake and she just falls to her ruin. But I think it's worth it. FE12 is a game where you still have a lot of good actions available. The rescue staff is very prominent in that game. You get it very early, and being able to use it multiple times across the chapter, even within the same turn, can be very nice. But other things as well, like if you're not playing Lunatic, if you're playing on lower difficulties, you have like the warp staff as well. Dancers are very good in warp skippy games, games where you can go fast through chapters, because you often have to seize multiple people. Generally your lord and the boss killer, for example, to like seize a map very quickly. So they're very good in like LTC settings, but even in casual settings, I think they're very, very good. I'm gonna put both Finas in S tier. I don't know which one of them would be rated better. I'm gonna give this one the benefit of the doubt and put this one higher, the new mystery one. But honestly, I could see them both like being equal, basically. I don't think there's like any particular factors between them that will make them better in one over the other. I guess FE12 has a higher difficulty setting, so you get more mileage out of them, whereas in FE3 doesn't always make a difference whether you use her or not. But you know, the opinions on that vary a lot. I think this version of Fina is either version is super good, basically. Now, in FE4, Genealogy of the Holy War, dancers are very, very known for being very, very busted, and with good reason, because so far Fina has just been refreshing one person, but Kaga said, no, we need to step it up a notch. Every dancer is going to be able to dance for 4 people, just straight up 4. Here you go. You want to dance for 4 people, refresh all of them, here you go. The drawback, of course, is, well, besides the usual dancer problems that they're very fragile, is their movement is a lot lower than your other characters. They only have 6 move, whereas most of your cavalry has like 9 or 8 at that point in the game. It's like Sylvia joins in chapter 2 and these join in chapter 7. So they have a hard time keeping up, and the only way to really make them keep up is the leg ring, and that's a very steep cost in order to be usable. I think dancers are either the best or the second best recipient for the leg ring, and it really depends on how you want to play the game, is whether you want to give it to them or not. Lately, I've been favoring giving the leg ring to Seliph and Sigurd instead of the actual dancer, and the reason is I feel like having one overpowered unit with like 12 or effectively 50 move because of road is better than having them able to keep up a bunch of other units. But I do think it's good to give it to them still. It's still a viable option. I think you can even do it once or twice during the LTC. Generally it's on the Lord, but I think you can get a lot of mileage out of them in here. I think if you want other units to keep up with your main lord, if you want to have like a big army of units that are able to keep up, having the leg ring on the dancer is better. But if you're trying to play as fast as you can, if you're trying to get the most out of your resources, if you want to maximize, if you want to min-max your units, then I think leg ring on the lord is better. But if you give leg ring to a dancer, then they are some of the best units in the game, because then you have a 9 move unit that can refresh 4 people at once, and that's super versatile. Another really good item for the dancers is the Night Ring, which I think they're literally the only candidate for when you think about it. The Night Ring is an item that basically just gives you Canto, like you're on a mount, except it doesn't give you extra move, but that's what the Night Ring is for, right? So the problem with the Night Ring is that foot units don't really make great use of it, because, well, you have 5 or 6 moves. You're probably going to move your full move almost every turn anyway, and once you get into combat, the extra movement you'll get out of the Night Ring is like very minimal, so you don't get much mileage out of the Night Ring no matter what. But for a dancer it's very useful, because often they have to sacrifice a little bit of move to dance for the right person, and they still want to move ahead. So even without the leg ring, it's pretty useful to have it on your dancer. The reason you don't give it to units with higher move is because they're all on horses and they already have Canto, so it's useless on them. So you give it to your dancer in conjunction with the leg ring or without it. I think it's best with it, of course, for them, but that depends on what you want to do with the leg ring. But I think the Night Ring, no matter what, should go on your dancer. So get it with Lachesis, keep her squad alive, keep her Paladin squad alive in chapter 2. You get the Night Ring on Lachesis, sell it to her, or sell it with her so she gets that 20k gold, and then try to buy it with Sylvia as soon as possible, and you'll get quite a bit of mileage out of it. And these rings, by the way, are the reason that I think I'm going to rank Layla quite a bit lower than the others, because here's the way they work, right? So Sylvia's in Gen 1, she's in chapter 2, helps Lewin get a couple of villages, and from there she's just a pretty good utility dancer. She probably won't be able to get the leg ring very soon. You get it at the end of chapter 3, basically, and she'll probably have enough gold by then to buy it if she wants to, or whether the player wants to give it to her. And I think like if you're okay with giving her the leg ring, then I think she's like an easy S tier unit up here. But the cost of the leg ring is very steep, so just for that I'm gonna move her down a little bit here. Just for the cost of the leg ring is pretty big, because if you give it to her, you can't give it to Sigurd, and I think that's a pretty big deal. If you give a stat booster or a ring to one unit, they can't give it to another. This is the reason I don't rate Larsa very high, because you can fix her movement with the leg ring, you know? The leg ring is something that makes everyone good. So the cost of using it with one unit is not being able to use it on other units. And I consequently do this across tier lists. It's not just the way to rib on Larsa. This is a problem for every unit, but she's the second best user of the leg ring, so it still deserves some credit in my book. So, at the end of Gen 1, you'll probably have the Night Ring and maybe the Leg Ring on Sylvia. And then you can pass it down to Lean. Or you can get Layla. Now, between these two units, there's been some debate on which one is better. I think by now most people think that Lean is the better one, which I'm an advocate of. I think Lean is better, because Lean gets to inherit items from Sylvia. So that means you can give the Leg Ring and or the Night Ring down to her without her having to pay a bunch of money. And dancers have some trouble coming by money. They're not very good at the rename. They can do some prayer cheese or some miracle cheese, I should say, but that's about it. That's about all the money they can get. They don't get money from weapon drops, and they have some trouble getting to villages sometimes. Sylvia thankfully has access to a bunch of villages if you want to give her gold in her starting position, so that can be a nice way to get her the money. You can also give her the bargain ring if you want. I generally put it on other units, but that works on her as well. So either the bargain ring or a bunch of villages, either way works. But that means that Lean doesn't really have to worry about cash, because she's just going to inherit all the items you ever want on her from Sylvia. But Layla has to buy all the items, because substitutes cannot inherit anything. They're new units, and her starting inventory is like, it has like one sword, and she gets the barrier sword from a village, and that's about it. So getting her money is a lot harder than getting it on Lean. And if you're doing a substitute playthrough, which is something a lot of people just do once when they're playing genealogies, is use all substitutes, then money is actually very scarce in early FE4 Gen 2, because no one inherits any money or items. You have to buy pretty much everything. Getting the Paragon Ring alone is like a huge chore for a lot of units, so gold is very precious. And in such an environment, it's actually pretty hard to get an item like the Leg Ring or the Night Ring. They both cost 40k to buy from the top of my head, so it's very expensive for a dancer that just... She might earn like maybe 17.5k from the arena if she clears all of it, and that's not even a given. Layla doesn't even have Miracle like Sylvia and Lean do, so the arena is not a given. She can win with the Sleep Edge, but that is something that Daisy wants to use as well, and selling it back and forth is very expensive. And yeah, the good thing about Layla though is that she has Charm, which can boost your unit's hit rate and avoid it a little bit. I generally don't find Charm too useful on dancers. They have to be very close to the battlefield in order to use that. And generally I find that they're better off when they're lagging a little bit behind your other units to stay safe, and keeping up with them is hard enough as it is, so I don't think Charm is too good on a dancer. I'd much rather have the Inheritance overall. So I'm going to put these like next to each other. I think Layla... honestly, if you're doing all substitute playthrough, I think I could move her down a little bit. I'm putting her here on the condition that she's your only substitute, basically, or one of your only ones. Like, you're not scarce like for money, like you're not hunting for money. In the context of a substitute playthrough, I would probably put her down here, or maybe here. But I'm assuming right now you're not pairing Sylvia because you want Layla for some reason, but you're still pairing everyone else, so you have the resources to give her the Leg Ring or the Night Ring. In that case, she's about as good as Lean is. Still a little bit worse, I think, because you still have to go out of your way to give her some gold, but she's still decent. But still, Dancers in FE4 are busted. I think the mobility problem is a real problem that they have. The Leg Ring is a pretty good fix if you want to give it to them, and they are good candidates, but I do think it's a little bit on the Lords. Alright, next up is Laura from Thracia. I tiered her recently on the biggest tier list, so not a whole lot to add to that, but, you know, if there were comments saying she was too high or too low, I would have reevaluated her a little bit. And I also recently rated her, well, semi-recently rated her on the Max Thracia playthrough, so I feel like I've been talking a lot about Laura, but I don't mind, because she's one of my favorite units. Thracia just does such a good job of making units and characters distinct from one another, and Laura is more unique than almost everyone else. At first, she's just a thief that joins in the Master Arc and just lockpicks her way through and maybe steals some vulneraries. She can't steal much else because even though you can steal weapons in Thracia, her build or her con isn't high enough to steal anything but like slim swords, so I generally consider her stealing utility to be kind of whatever. She can steal like a dorky or a vulnerary somewhere, but she's very fragile, so it's hard to keep her alive if you have her fight. Thankfully, Laura doesn't have to fight very much in this stage of the game. In fact, she's mostly useful when she doesn't fight, because you can use her to make enemies capture her. What she does is, like, you put her in range of enemies, and they will usually try to capture any player units that have no weapons equipped as long as they can. And with Lara's low build, they're practically guaranteed to try to capture her. They almost always prioritize that over attacking. The only exception is like bosses, for example, that are programmed not to capture. But literally any enemy, any generic will try to capture Lara, and that will have their stats, make them easier to kill or capture with your other units. So really, really good bait for enemies at this point in the game. And of course, the lockpicking in Master is good because Master is full of doors and chests that you gotta open. And Lara also has a movement star, which can add a little bit of speed to getting chests unexpectedly. It's not something you can rely on, but over the course of like a long chapter, like chapter 4 or chapter 4X, it's bound to happen once or twice, and it'll save you a bit of time when it does. So 5% over the course of a bunch of turns, that can still add up to like 50, 70%. I don't know, depends on the odds. And then that utility alone is pretty good, enough for like, I don't know, a B tier or maybe an A tier, depends on how long it lasts. But in chapter 12X, you can promote her into a dancer through like a secret talking event with a recruitable character there, and she turns into a dancer like everyone else. So she has the availability of most other dancers by having like dance utility from halfway through the game, but on top of that, she has all that capture bait and lockpicking and stealing utility from the early game. So that adds up to me to like a 5-star unit. I was very surprised to see Mags rate her like, I think 3 or 4 stars. I think it was 4, but I think she's an easy 5-star. No way she's not. And I think that's good enough to put her... I feel like she's better than Layla, but I'm not entirely sure about Lean and Sylvia. Although they have their own ability issues for a little bit. I said this before, but I rate Gen FE4 units as if they're like... as if their generation that they're in is the whole game. Because if I use like availability... like if I use an argument against these, like they're not around for Gen 2 in her case and Gen 1 in one case, then pretty much everyone from FE4 is like C or D tier, which is something I don't want to do except for Finn, because he's around for most of the gen, not even all of it. No one has perfect availability in FE4 if you rate both gens as one game combined. So I just treat both gens as separate games, and in that way Sylvia joins like a little before halfway through the game, and Lean joins also a little bit before the second half of the game. So in that way, I think Lara has better availability than them. The 4-way dancing though is just... I don't think I've stressed enough how good 4-way dancing is. Having 4 units attack again, that just makes you wipe out entire armies. It's so freaking busted. I just kind of skimmed over it because I thought it was obvious, but it's so good. It's so good. So I think Lara's alright. Like her dancing utility in FE5 is still great. That game is full of warp skips and great things you can do with your dancer. Warp staff, rescue staff, sleep staff. Being able to use your best staff twice in the late game it's basically as if you have another A rank staff user, but you can copy the best one you have instead of having to raise another one or worry about another one. And she can still do capture bait late game too, but dancing in FE5 is absolutely overpowered. The one drawback she has within FE5 is that she fatigues whenever she dances. She gets +1 fatigue for every dance, I believe. So there might be some chapters where she has to sit out. I don't find this too huge of an issue. You get a lot of S-strings, partially thanks to her dancing utility in chapter 14 and chapter 14X, as well as like ability to steal extra items whenever she dances someone that needs to steal. So I don't mind the cost of giving her like an S-string once or twice throughout the game. That's about how often I want it, but it is worth noting that you don't want to spam dancing with Lara too much, in my opinion. It gives you XP, but the XP doesn't do very much on her. You don't really care about her stats, but the fatigue is kind of annoying. So generally, with most units, you want to dance whenever you can, even just to get the XP. There's no drawback to it, but with Lara, there is a drawback. You gotta watch out for that. Alright, next we have some more traditional dancers, I would say. We have the GBA ones, starting with Lorem from the Binding Blade. And there's not too much to say about Lorem once you know how a dancer works. You know, you move 5 tiles, you dance someone, you move on with your life, and hopefully towards a better tile. I generally think Lorem is good, even though she doesn't have anything special like the rings or the 4-way dance or anything. Just because in FE6, player phase is pretty important. It is definitely a player phase game. I know I've had a lot of people ask me about like what makes a player phase based game, what makes an enemy phase based game, which do you prefer, what do they like, and I definitely want to do like a video specializing on that. But generally what it means is in your player phase based game, enemies are a threat. You want to avoid counterattacks, and a lot of the important combat takes place on player phase, hence the name. Whereas an enemy phase game, enemies are not much of a threat, and you do a lot of work on enemy phase because your units are durable enough to take on a lot of enemies at once. So those are the games where you just sweep a lot of enemies with javelins and hand axes. So it generally includes FE7, FE8, FE9. FE10 to a large extent as well in the late game. Generally when the player is a lot stronger than the enemy, then you got an enemy phase based game. And those games, dancers are not as good because, well, dancers are not very good on enemy phase, they specialize on player phase. And the reverse is true for, say, FE6, and as well as like Shadow Dragon, New Mystery, Just games generally with a high difficulty setting will usually be player face based games, and that includes FE6 and it definitely includes Lorem. I think Lorem is a very good dancer for that reason, even though there isn't much to say about her that you couldn't say about other dancers. I mean, she's fragile, you have to keep her in mind. One thing she does have that a lot of other dancers don't, except for Laura, is that you can rescue drop her to places, and FE6 has a lot of good mounted units, so getting her to places where you want it to be is definitely fairly easy to do. You just gotta plan for it. Again, if you plan for Lorem's use, she's gonna be your best unit, or copying your best unit, making your best unit do something again. And I particularly like her for FE6 because it has a really huge range warp. So warp skipping is a very viable strategy, and again, dancers are great in warp skips. They're also great in casual play, but in warp skips I think they deserve an extra big mention. So I think Lorem is definitely an S tier. It's just going to be a matter of where exactly in S tier you put her. I think she's better than Layla. It might look weird to have a bunch of people between Lean and Layla, but I definitely think she's a cut above. But the four-way dancing is hard to beat. I still think Laura's extra availability and thief utility beats out Lorem's dancing utility, since they both have pretty good dancing utilities, but Laura has that extra availability over her. So I think it's fair to put her below here. Next we have Nils and Ninian, really the same unit when you think about it. The only difference I think is that one of them has more con than the other. I believe Ninian has one more constitution than Nils. I think she's supposed to be older as a human at least. Nils joins in Limb mode like chapter 7, and then later on when you re-recruit the pair of them, I guess, New Resolve, you get Ninian. Then when spoilers happen, you get Nils instead. And you basically keep Nils for the rest of the game, so it's like victory or death basically. So that's pretty much how they work. They're the same unit, they share stats, even though their stats don't matter. I guess it was important enough to mention. The biggest distinguishing factor for Nils and Ninian compared to other units is Nini's Grace and the other dancer rings that they come with. They are temporary buffs, kind of like the precursor to rallies when you think about it. What you do is instead of dancing, use a special dance, and they will boost a unit's stat by 10. Ninja's Grace boosts defense, and you have a couple of other ones. There's Phila's Might, which boosts attack by 10, and you got a couple of other ones that aren't really that good. One of them boosts Avoid, the other one boosts Crit, but neither of them are very relevant. The most important one is by far Ninja's Grace. Usually, I find dancing itself to be more powerful than these rings, and I don't think it's notable reason to put them above, but I think Ninja's Grace deserves a special mention because it can give units a good enemy phase, and they actually happen to be in a very enemy phase based game, so this can be very important. So what you can do is you can take a unit with 1 to range and good offense, but slightly miserable defenses, boost their defenses by 10. Ninja's Grace will boost both their defense and their resistance by 10 effectively, and this will make them easy to sweep just enemies with. So it's hard to think of like a good example because this sounds very good on paper. I haven't found this as useful in practice as it sounds, but let's say you have Lucius who with Ninja's Grace could survive a lot of more enemies, like could actually take down an entire group of enemies, but he just has trouble doing so to reduce durability. You can boost him up with Ninja's Grace, have him sweep anything. I find that Lucius is so frail he still dies, but that's just an example. You can probably find more practical examples when you're playing. So I think that's pretty good for Ninja's Grace. I think Phila's Might is much less useful. Generally, if you can Phila's Might a unit, you can also dance for them again, and that will probably make them do more damage. So boosting their attack by 10 doesn't really do very much. That dancing wouldn't already, but it is notably useful against the final boss for being able to one-hit KO him. That's about it though. Generally I don't really use that one very much, but it's available for a pretty significant amount of time too, like from the desert level onwards. So that's pretty good. There are some other things. The rings, they actually make you immune to status effects. That's kind of like a little piece of trivia. That's because they are status effects, but positive ones, and enemies do not like to override enemy status effects, so that also works with like poison, for example. If you get someone poisoned, they will probably not get berserked or put to sleep or silenced or anything, so pretty useful in like Sands of Time, for example. But you can also use Ninja's Grace for that reason. Only works for 1 turn, unless you rescue someone. If you rescue someone, status effects will persist. They will not like wear off. Like for example, poison wears off at like 5 turns, and so do the other effects. And Ninja's Grace wears off in 1 turn, but if you rescue someone, you can keep him around, and that will let you use these effects in the arena, for example, if you want to. So all pretty neat effects, and those are like some niche things. Most of their utility still comes from dancing. I would still put Ninian pretty high, but as I said, I think FE7 is pretty player phase based, and I find Ninja's Grace less useful in practice than it sounds in theory. It's still super strong. I'm just waiting for like a good use. I've definitely used it a couple times, but I don't find it to be a super big deal. So I think they're still S tier units. I'm just going to treat them as the same unit, basically just one unit with like different availability. I just generally call them Ninials for that reason. I just think they're one unit, but Ninian's obviously a more impactful one because she's around for a lot longer. If I tiered Nils separately, he'd be a lot lower because he's really in only a couple of Hector mode chapters, but I consider them the same units for the sake of this list. Next up is Tethys from Sacred Stones. There's no rings here. This is just a dancer with half game availability and not a whole lot else to say. The route split is kind of not nice to her. She's good in Erica route where she joins, I would say, exactly at the halfway point in the game, like chapter 10, that's basically halfway through, right? And then in Ephraim route, she joins in chapter 13 instead, which is a good chapter to join, but it's like about 2/3 into the game, a little less than that if you consider that the early maps are a lot shorter than the later maps. That's a little disappointing, but other than that, still a really good dancer. FE8 is definitely an enemy phase based game, so having an extra attack is less useful than you might think sometimes, but at the same time, I've used Teth so much in like faster, more efficient playthroughs, like any kind of playthroughs. I still find Teth to be extremely useful for other reasons the dancer are useful for. Making Seth move in further to kill more enemies is just good. Making your staff users be able to warp further, having them warp multiple times is still very good in the late game of FE8, which is very warp skippable. So again, points for the warp skipping here. But again, even for just more casual playthroughs, dancing is super OP in FE8. You still have the option to rescue drop her around. You still have the option to do all sorts of like things and combos with her. Something like chapter 19, warp skipping there can be kind of tricky, for example, because Reeve is hidden in the fog and you cannot warp someone in the fog. So you need like a torch staff to refuel him, and then you need to like cover some nice distance. That's kind of hard to like do when FE8 nerfs your warp range. This is one of the reasons I don't like Ninian Nils as much, is that game isn't very friendly to warp skipping. There's really only a couple maps, like 1, 2, maybe 3, that warp skipping really helps in. And rescue staff isn't very available either in that one. Donan is working on FE7 0% growth, and I think we'll be able to demonstrate that right here. But yeah, Teth is useful. I would say a little more useful than Ninian, perhaps. I know that Ninian has the rings, but I think FE8's player phase uses for warp and stuff are a little bit more important than the rings. But I know some people might disagree with that, but I'm going to put Teth over Ninian. Although, I would say Erica route Teth is better, but maybe not Ephraim route. So maybe it's more fair to put her below. I'm gonna go with the majority opinion. I think Teth is a bit worse, but I still think she's an S tier unit. You know, if you ever play like a Fire Emblem draft or anything, like some kind of race or LTC race or just a casual run, I think you'll find that Teth is like a really good pick for those, for example. Okay, next up we have the Herons, and Herons are pretty cool and special and very distinct from the others. A lot of them fly, for instance, and they have the option to refresh multiple people sometimes. It depends on which one we're talking about, but in Path of Radiance, there's really only one Heron that we need to talk about, and that is Raisin. He joins, I think, the same chapter they get a promoted Ike for, so around chapter 18. And he starts off untransformed, which just means he's still a better dancer, because he has like the same ability as others, but he flies, and I don't think he has Canto in that game. He doesn't just move after dancing. I think he needs a Night Ring for that. Someone rightfully corrected me on that a while ago. So he needs a Night Ring, but you get that very soon after he joins anyway, and there's really no better candidate for it, because just like in FE4 with the Night Ring there, anyone who has to move to really make use of Canto already has Canto because they're on a horse. So there's not much of a point in putting the Night Ring on, say, Ike or, I don't know, Mia or something. So I think Raisin is a good candidate for that one. But it can be traded around. It's not a consumable. You just put it on someone. They don't need to like spend gold on it either. So Nightwing Raisin is pretty good. And yeah, he's a good dancer. But then if the map takes long enough or you use a Lagoon Stone, he will transform. And he will gain more mobility, like even more than he had before. And gain the ability to dance for 4 people. And when we know from FE4 just how broken this can be. Like letting Titania, Oscar, Kieran, Marcia, Jill, Tanith, 4 of those just move again, attack something. Again, that's 4 extra enemies you can clean up. Now, I think in like Path of Radiance English version, like just hard mode, this isn't that super good because it's a very enemy phase based game. It's a very easy game. All the enemies just kind of suck. It's really on Maniac mode where I think it shines, and I really noticed this in Max's Maniac mode playthrough. Any turn again where he plans out where to dance with Raisin, where to put him, and this is actually like with 4-way dancers, this requires like a bit more planning because you need the space to be where Raisin to go is to be free. And you need units to Canto into places around that. And if you don't plan that little diamond shape out in like a tight corridor or something, you really get stuck and end up figuring only like 3 people or 2, or figuring someone who's not going to end up doing anything. So making use of that properly is really key to getting through FE9 a lot faster and playing it better. So if you do that though, Raisin is absolutely worth it, and absolutely worth using a Lagoon Stone every now and then. I think you get a couple of them. They are worth using on your other units sometimes. Someone like Mordecai or Moarim, transforming them early can be nice. The Demi Band is good, but it kind of reduces their stats. Sometimes you just want a fully transformed one. But I think Raisin overall is a much better investment. And the same goes for FE10 Raisin, as you'll see. I think FE9 Raisin is, I would say, around this area somewhere. This is like where I'm putting most of the dancers, I realized by now. I definitely think they're still all a cut above Zane. So I think I'm going to put him like around... I think above Platini is fair, because the 4-way dance is pretty good. But it's also tempted to put him like here, for example, because 4-way dance is really, really good. But FE6, I think it makes a big difference to have that dancer, because the game is just so much more difficult, and there's more of a challenge to it. So the dancer makes a bigger difference. So I'm actually going to put him like down below, because FE9 is just pathetically easy. Alright, I ended up putting him here. Let me know what you think. Next we have FE10, which has 3 Herons with very different traits. Raisin works basically the same as before, except now he doesn't need the Night Ring because it doesn't exist in this game. He just has the Kanto skill, so we can just move again. I believe Kanto was actually a mistranslation of some kind. It's kind of weird how they ended up naming the move again ability Kanto, because Kanto or Canto, I believe, is Latin. It's like a Latin verb that means singing. I believe Kanto literally means I sing. I took Latin in school for like 1 year, and that's how I know that stuff. Or rather, how I can like memorize that stuff, sort of. So I sort of know that Kanto shouldn't really be the singing ability, but it ended up being so, and so now we just call moving again Kanto. Anyway, he basically works the same, but this time he's not just joining like halfway through the game or past halfway through the game. He joins in part 3, around halfway through that, so he has about as much availability of a unit that you can respect in Radiant Dawn. That's not like a Grill Mercenary or an early joining Dawn Brigade member. Kind of okay availability, but not great, but Radiant Dawn is very messy in that regard. Raphael is an early joining Heron that actually is footlocked. He cannot fly because his wings got burned, so he only has like 5 move. And he's not around too much before part 4. He's only around in, I would say, 2 maps. The final chapter and the swamp map. I think that one is 1.8. So only a couple maps. And he's very useful in, I would say, 1, maybe 2 of those. Very good, because he refreshes 4 people, always. Raisin needs to transform, but Raphael always, like, just dances 4 people. And that's super, super good. And definitely worth planning around. But it can be tricky to do. The final chapter of part 1 has a lot of like tight corridors and ledges and stuff where he will rarely be able to figure more than like 2 people. But if you still make use of them, you can figure some of the best player phase units around. The best units, period. Like dancing for Nylon and Black Knight to just go ahead and kill more stuff is still super good. So I would not count out Raphael as a really good unit. And then Leanne joins in part 2. And she's not around for very long. She's around in like 1 part 3 map, I believe, 311, and I think a little bit. Trying to remember. Yes, she's only running 1 part 3 map before part 4. And in part 4, you have all of them basically, and you can pick one for the tower. And Leanne is always flying, and she's kind of like a compromise between the two. Leanne only dances 2 people at a time, but she always flies. She always has Kanto, so it's like a half transformed version of Raisin, if you will. Whereas Raphael's like, alright, you lose the wings, you lose Kanto, but you have the ability to figure people always. I think Raphael in a vacuum is the best one, and I always recommend picking him for endgame, because endgame is very short, so transforming is a big pain in the butt, and Raisin is the only one for who transforming does anything, but I think Raphael is just always better than Leanne in endgame. The movement doesn't matter very much, but figuring 4 people matters way more, especially if you're 1-turning or 2-turning the maps. Even if you're not, I still think it's a better choice than Leanne. If you're taking a long time in endgame, I can potentially see Raisin being better, but only if you like expect to take a very long time in all these maps and you have just resources to transform Raisin quickly in every map, so like Laguz Stones or Laguz Gems, which is possible, but there are like, you have Gift Cat to transform as well, and Gareth needs like a stone as well. Generally you have those available, but it's just something to keep in mind. There's a Laguz Gem available early part 4, and if you've been using it on like Janaf or Olki, for example, then you might not have access to it anymore. So keep that in mind, but generally I would recommend Raphael for endgame. I know some people like Raisin. I think Raphael is the best by far. Leanne is an okay choice. I do think Leanne, I talked about this with Rengor a while ago, I do think Leanne is a candidate for the best out of these 3 if we take their availability into account, because in part 3, Raisin is good for like a little bit, but a lot of part 3 maps are like slow, and regardless of contributions, like 7, the one where the Ike Brigade, the Grill Mercenaries are trying to cross the river to the Black Knight, you know, the swamp map. Raisin joins there, but doesn't really do very much because the map's is time-based anyway, so there's not much of a point in transforming. It's just like a free XP map, basically. And there's a couple maps like that where Raisin just doesn't matter that much. He's not around for 311, that's where Leanne is. And the maps after that, I think Raisin's pretty good, but most of those maps are very enemy phase based, and I find that Raisin, after he dances for 4 people, like let's say he dances for like Hard, Titania, Ike, maybe Oscar or something. After that, I find that he doesn't really keep up with those units anymore, so he's mostly just stuck dancing for foot units that are just picking up stragglers, and they can do that fine on his own. And in fact, having to protect him kind of becomes a liability almost, because enemy density in FE10 is so high that sometimes it's better to just leave him out of combat entirely, like leave him away from combat and just have people enemy face enemies than it is to use him. But it's been a while since I played Radiant Dawn, but that's what I remember from maps like 310, 311, that area of availability. Kind of like the area where I say Xane becomes worse, that's what I think Racing also becomes worse. Lian, on the other hand, she's also in like a defend-ish map in 2P, the Survive map with Valencia and Marcia and friends. That one I don't think she's very good in. But I think she's great in like 2E, for example, and the map with Lucia in part 2. She's good in that one as well, like 2-2. And she's pretty good in 311, I guess. That's where she joins when Raisin is absent. And then she's pretty alright in part 4 maps. Raisin is also like one of the worst part 4 maps pre-endgame, in the one where you kill Izuka. I don't think he's very useful in that one. He can help getting the 1 turn, I guess, but I think you only need the rescue staff for that. But Raisin might be needed for that one, I'm not sure. I guess that's an okay contribution. But I think Lian has like better availability overall, which is weird because I think she's in less chapters. But I think that was how the argument went. Now that I'm hearing it, I'm not entirely convinced myself either. And I think most people will just find Raisin better. I think Raphael's the best in a vacuum, but his lack of availability really hurts him. He's only in 2 maps, and I think he's really good in 1 and okay in the Swamp 1, kind of good. I think they all belong in the same place, which I'm pretty sure is going to be S tier. I'm just trying to think about the order. I'm probably going to go with this. Raisin as the better one for now, but I could see them go any way that you like. I still say he's the best for endgame, so maybe I should be ranking them by that instead of how good I think they are relative to one another. I think you could go like almost any way. I think they're alright. I think they're like super good, obviously. But FE10 is so enemy phase based that I find them less useful than the actual normal dances, I think. Although maybe they should be closer to FE10 Raisin or FE9 Raisin. Maybe FE9 Raisin should move down. Tough one. Their availability is just kind of trash. That really is the main problem. It's like, I feel like Teth relatively has more availability to speak of, for example. At least Erica Route Teth is. Alright, next are the 3DS emblems. I will admit once again, I am not the biggest expert on these. I do plan on replaying Conquest soon. But Awakening and the other Fates games are either very distant memories or they've been a long while, and I haven't played those at a high level like I've played for the other games. So Olivia, I think the biggest problem for her, that most other players encounter, I think, is the ambush reinforcements. The fact that the Awakening maps are wide open with somewhat unpredictable ambush spawns that can just kill Olivia on like any mode besides normal mode. That's really makes her annoying to use. I think if you have good knowledge of the game, you know exactly when everything spawns, you can keep her safe just fine. But for any blind players, that's kind of tedious to use. And Awakening also feels like a game that's all about juggernauting, very enemy phase based on hard mode. If you're doing something like a Robin solo, for example, the easiest way to clear Lunatic, you have almost no point in using Olivia other than maybe to get him a couple extra squares to get a 1 turn somewhere. Because if you're soloing, you just don't need the Dancer. If you're playing with a normal team, dancing's still pretty good. You can do some fun shenanigans, I believe, with pair up and switching and getting another dance in. And of course, you have a very wide availability to rescue staff, which Olivia can also work with very well. It being an E-rank staff and being buyable makes it a very, very strong option for players. So I would say Olivia's pretty good, but I think she's harder to put to use for most casual players. And I think even for people who are playing at a higher level, she can be more difficult to utilize, but I think she's still needed for a couple of quick clears. There is a 0% growth run for Awakening done by Espinosa. That was finally finished a while ago, and I think Olivia does some work in that, but I don't remember exactly how much. I think for casual players, she's harder to use than all these units combined, basically, because of those ambush reinforcements, and her being so frail that any enemy is just gonna like skewer her. But I think with enough pair-up tricks and other utility, she could still be made viable. I don't know if I put her over the Herons or not. I'm kind of tempted to just add her to the end of S tier. I've always found her one of the least impressive dancers, but there's still no denying that dancing itself is an S tier ability. I don't think she should go outside of it. So far we've been just putting units in S tier all along. I don't know if we should have or not, but that's what it felt like to me. I thought for sure some of them might drop down to A tier, and I'm still thinking about moving like Raisin or like one of the other Herons, or maybe Olivia down. But it's still been S tier. It's still been S tier for me. But I think the individual ranking of where exactly they go is still interesting enough to take a look at. Next up is Azura from Fire Emblem Fates, and she's in all 3 routes. I know that much. I know Conquest isn't in. I know Conquest isn't in Saizo, guys. I know Conquest isn't in Saizo. Don't worry. Azura, I think, is one of the best dancers, and that's simply the availability speaking. She joins so early on every single route. She's available for a little bit of the branch of fate, basically the share part, and then she's available for basically the entire rest of the route for, I think, every route. I know she's in Revelation a fuck ton, like she never leaves, and I know she joins in like the first map of Real Conquest route. Not sure about Birthright, but I think she joins pretty early as well there. I know I remember her singing to Takumi in like one of the first Birthright maps, so pretty sure she's all there. And that automatically, like when you have a dancer that's around that much, that's great. Fates is another really good trick that Azura really makes use of, and that's using Shelter to give her multiple turns. I think you can do this with Olivia too, but with Azura it's like more explicit. I believe the way it works is you have a multi-unit use Shelter on Azura, and then you have someone else take that, take Azura from them, and then you switch around and then Azura just gets another turn. I don't know why exactly that works, but it does, and it allows for some really crazy shit. It can be hard to utilize, especially if you've paired up a lot of other units and you're not exactly on the lookout for it. But if you know how to look out for it and you know how to position your units well in Fates, it can really give a lot of extra turns to your dancer. And having one dancer turn is already godly, but having more is super amazing. So I'm gonna put Azura like right up here. Between the high availability and the fact that she's just can dance multiple times in a turn is just so busted. I'm gonna put her like right up here. I think she's absolutely sick. I think she's great. Super good unit, and I definitely look forward to using her and then watching her die a lot of times, because God, Conquest boys, Conquest. Okay, next up we have an unfamiliar face perhaps. This is Anakin from The Last Promise. I already said I love plugging Last Promise when I get a chance to. Anakin is a weird unit. He joins in the equivalent of Limb mode, and he's only around for the chapter he joins in, and then he just leaves, and he doesn't come back until basically Elwood mode. And from there he's your Lord, and you have a Lord as your dancer, which is a very weird combo. Very strange to feel, and even has a forced promotion. Whenever I replay Last Promise, I find myself not using Anakin for combat much because dancing is so much better. But the result of dancing a lot is that you get a lot less XP. Dancing only gives 10 XP in the GBA games, and Anakin, you might get like 30 to 40 XP from killing something, but it's really worth it, because if you're only using him for dancing, then why would you train him in combat? As a result, he's just not very good in combat, even though he's supposed to be a dancer that can fight as well. He uses light magic, I believe. He has the "you can do it" dance, which is the most important detail about any of these dancers. They all have their cute old animations. A lot of them have their own music too. Anakin just says "you can do it," and it's absolutely crazy, absolutely great, absolutely gorgeous, absolutely fantastic, absolutely great. So I like Anakin a lot. Last Promise doesn't have that many dancing shenanigans. Nothing the likes that say Azura and Olivia can do. Kind of funny that they're so far apart, come to think of it. But it's still a dancer, it's still super good, and he's very available in the main quest. If you don't count Secret mode, which I think I am going to count, because it's a lot more involved than Limb mode is. Limb is basically a tutorial, but Secret mode is like actual chapters, so I would say he basically joins for like the first... He's around for like 3/4 of the game, which is still pretty good. So I would say he's better than, say, Tethys and maybe even Nilcium. I would put him around here somewhere. I think this is an okay tier for him. Still an S tier. Warp, I don't think it's even in The Last Promise, so it doesn't really factor into his use very much. Azura also doesn't get to use the shenanigans very much, by the way. I don't think there's a warp in Conquest at all that she can really make use of. I know there's a warp skill, but that's a very different thing than what she has. Anakin doesn't really have anything like that from what I remember. So that's not super great for him. And Last Promise maps are like very hard to skip anyway. There are some you can like 1 or 2 turn, but most of them are like super big route maps or seas maps that are just very hard to skip through. I think Anakin's good, and he's very useful in the late game for just having extra player phase unit to take care of all those strong enemies. I like him a lot for that. I think it's more useful than Indian and Nils. But like, don't forget, this is all S tier still. This is all the S tier. Okay, last we have the 3 Houses squad. We have Dorothea and Marianne. Now this is very tough to rate on this kind of skill, because I'm kind of assuming that they're becoming dancers, and I want to give them credit for dancing utility, but at the same time we have to acknowledge that they are not the only dancers in the game. If I want to have a dancer in like FE5, for example, I have to use Laura. If I want to use a dance in FE7, I have to use Nils or Ninian. This is not the case for D, so it's very tough to evaluate. But I want to talk a little bit about the choice of your dancers. A lot of people seem to like the riding boon for dancers, and I understand why. It's because their combat doesn't really matter, and because they want to get the move +1 skill, but I think it's like such a tiny factor. Like one move on your dancer, is that what's going to determine everything? The way I see a dancer in 3 houses is you pick one of your students in-house or out of house, and you make him fit to be your dancer, and then you don't invest anything else in them, and you still get a very good unit, a dancer. Super good, but you don't have to train them. I do not understand why you would train up a unit in like levels and everything, and give him XP and maybe stat boosters and tutoring and everything, and then just make him your dancer, because if you're going to do that, you could get so much more value out of your units by picking someone else to be your dancer. Dancers are just not that good at combat. They can be, I guess, with Sword Avoid +20, if you're doing a combo with that, like getting a bunch of Avoid on, say, Ferdinand, or, I don't know, Dimitri, for example. That can work, but if you're doing it to make them your dancer, I think you're doing it wrong. I think you want your dancer to be uninvested so that you have more resources to give to your other units and still have a really good dancer to work with. I think that is the optimal way to use a dancer. And the move +1 skill, I think, is a very small factor. What you should instead look at, I think, is what unit is like easy to recruit for me, cost me like little resources. Kind of depending on how you go about it though, because at some point you can just kind of recruit anyone you want without investing too much, depending on like how much money you have, how many gifts. Depends on the difficulty you're playing on, depends on whether you're playing New Game Plus or not, of course. But I think +1 move is like such a small factor. I think even without a riding boon, you can still get to, I think it's S move or S horses as riding that you need to get the +1 move. So I think even, I don't know, someone who's neutral to that can probably reach it. They'll probably get it a little sooner, but I don't think it's that big of a factor. And especially for units that are like good at healing, like Dorothea and Marianne, I love the option to dance for someone who uses Physic. So if Marianne is going to be your only Physic user and your only dancer, you're rarely going to have the option to heal 2 people. So I think that's kind of annoying. You probably want to have another Physic user if that's the case. And in that case, why not just recruit someone else to be the dancer and then have them dance for Marianne to get double Physic. Same for Dorothea. For Dorothea, what I do like about her being a dancer is that she gets Meteor, so she can be used for linked attacks. Now, linked attacks were kind of nerfed in 3 houses in update patch. I think before they gave huge hit bonuses to literally anyone, but then they changed it to where it only works for people who are supporting with your unit, and that nerfed Dorothea quite a bit. I think before she just boosted everyone's hit by a lot, kind of like using a leadership star, and now she's mostly supporting with the Blue Lions and the Black Eagle. She doesn't support that many Golden Deer students, and as a result, the hit isn't that great. I still think she's very good, but I find it hard to give him exclusive points for just using Dancing Utility. I think it adds to your army. I think that's a nice boon for these units specifically, that they are fairly good at dancing. Like the linked attack for her. And then, for example, the fact that Marianne grants you the option to skip hunting by daybreak through like a combo. If you haven't seen that video, it comes down to the fact that she joins in a very specific location where she can dance for, what was it? I think it's Lysithia, or... Yeah, no, never mind, I figured it out. What you do is you warp Marianne to next to Claude, who kills the boss twice, and Marianne dances Claude to make sure you can attack twice. That's the way you skip hunting by daybreak on a Golden Deer. That's her exclusive utility. I like that. So as dancers, I would say, like, if I gave them exclusive credit for dancing utility, which I think in 3 houses is very strong. Some people think it's bad because Stride exists and Warp exists, but I think those things all stack. And with the huge amount of kill boss maps that 3 houses has, you can't discount the use of a dancer. There's so many paralogs you can skip easily, like the Lorem's paralog and the Ignatz Raphael paralog, for example. Even the Edelgard paralog, for example. All those can be skipped thanks to your dancer. You can do it in other means, but dancers make this a lot easier. So I think discounting them just because 3 houses has a lot of other movement options is silly. All these things are super good for dancers. If I give them exclusive credit for their dancing utility, I just have them up here in S tier somewhere. I can't be bothered to figure out exactly where I would put them, but I think they're pretty good. And if I weren't giving them credit for that, I would put them like probably around Zane's level, like B or A tier or something. I don't remember exactly where I put them, where I put Dorothea in my tier list, or Marianne in the biggest units tier list. I think I ended up putting Marianne with the other 3 houses units in B, and Dorothea maybe in C somewhere. But if I give them credit for dancers, like I said I was going to, and if I'm going to be consistent, I would definitely put them around. I think they're better than most of these. I'm going to put them around here somewhere. I think Marianne is the better dancer by a little bit, but I also like the leadership star that Dorothea provides. Again, I could have put like anyone from 3 houses on this list. For example, I kind of like Ingrid as well. if you like the riding boon and she has that, Ingrid isn't very good on blue lions, period, I think. So it's kind of a good idea to make her a dancer if you just get her some charm to be able to win the contest. I think that's generally a bit of an overrated thing. You just need to be able to get, I think, 14 charm guarantees to win. So as long as you can get there with the +5 from the tutoring that you give them, I don't think the charm is a very big factor. Pretty much anyone's going to get there. I like Sylvain because you can recruit him in any route, add him to your army, and then just be able to do the thing. So all that works. So yeah, there's the dancer tier list. I honestly didn't expect all of them to be put in S tier. I was expecting a couple of them to go in A tier other than Zane. But I guess it just ended up being the S tier party after all. So I guess I haven't seen anything this top heavy since the last top heavy tier list with the dragons, I think, the wyvern riders. But yeah, that's gonna be it. I will see you guys next time. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I forgot any dancers. God, I hope not. And we'll see you next time, probably for some big tier lists. Peace out and goodbye.